Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming. Relatively late notice, I think, in terms of the organizing of the Doug meetup, but that's great. As Anoop introduced me, Mike Kreaden and Dave Carroll. One of the things that we're going to give you here is kind of behind the scenes, a little bit of the folklore behind the platform. So kind of before we start, I actually want to find out kind of how far back we go, because we're actually going to start at the beginning. But why don't we just start kind of 3 years. 3 years working with the platform. Let's see hands. Okay, 3 years or more? 3 years or more, right. Okay, now we're getting some hands. Okay, 5 years or more. Oh, that's excellent. How about if we go to 8? That gets us back to the AppExchange time. Oh, excellent. And let's go way back now. How about 12? We still have? Oh, of course, yes, hello. There we go, even Jimson back there. So 15? Okay, now I know exactly where we're starting. So we're going to go back like 17 years. Okay, so of course, in terms of starting off, we have Safe Harbor. Everyone here, I'm sure that everyone here is actually an expert on Safe Harbor. So I'm not even going to belabor you with this one, but this will be the last one of the corporate slides. Because as we start here, we're going to be taking you back now. Okay? So we're going to get into the history of why we're calling this back to Sforce. But for the time being, why don't we start way back at the beginning? So how many people have been to Dreamforce? Okay, yes. Excellent. How many people know the history of Salesforce in terms of where it started? Did it start in an office? Okay, so let's find out the real backstory there. So back in the beginning, 1999. There's actually the backstory in terms of how Parker and Mark met. I don't know if it's widely circulated. But actually, Mark at the time was actually rolling out of Oracle. It was 1999. He was already starting more than one company. I'll let Dave actually get into one of the other companies. But one of those companies is Salesforce. He wants to start up, and he's obviously well connected in the Valley. One of the things that he wants to do is he wants to get the best and the brightest in terms of tech folks. So he goes to an ex-Oracle guy who was actually running Clarify at the time, which was early CRM, and he was asking, hey, do you know anybody that you can recommend? And he said, actually, I had 3 guys that just left Clarify. I'm still contracting with them because they were doing kind of a lead kind of module for them at the time. But he said, sure, I'll give you an introduction. So he drives over to their offices in San Francisco. Left Coast Software is the name of the company. 3 individuals. You know one for sure, Parker Harris. And the other 2, Frank Dominguez and Dave Molinoff. How many people remember Dave Molinoff? Anybody? This is incredible. So the real genius behind Salesforce at the time, from a tech perspective, was Dave Molinoff. He was most probably the most skilled Oracle developer at the time. But with the emerging web technologies, early ASPs and all that stuff, he was basically the architect's architect in terms of really figuring out how to do it. The original app server that Salesforce was built on, Dave Molinoff put together. He basically used open source software, Lucene and others, and put together the app server that everything was built around. So the startup famously was actually an apartment that Mark rented out next to where he was living on Telegraph Hill. And he stuck the 3 guys in there, and he said, have at it. At the time, he hired another individual, Teen Zo's his name. We'll get to him in a minute. And that was how they started. 1 product manager, 3 developers. In 3 months, they had an early alpha that was good enough for Mark to actually shop around to his friends, which included Larry Ellison, some other Silicon Valley notables, Esther Dyson, Halsey Minor, Frank Tomlinson, and he asked them each, all that I want from you is $1 million each. And give me 1 year. Don't stick your nose in my business, just let me run. And lucky enough for all of us, they actually did that. So after the first year of Salesforce, and if you're going back all the way to the first year of Salesforce, we actually gave the product away for free. 5 users free, $50 a month thereafter. We didn't know what to do with the money when it started coming in the first year. Because people started paying. We figured it's 5 users, early users of Salesforce. Do you know that if you have 1 license, you can actually log in more than once? So we didn't figure anybody would pay. We ended up the first year with $6.8 million in revenue. and 3,500 customers. Most of them arguably were free customers at that time. So let's advance to 2001, which is when I started in the company. So, well, officially. So 2001, I go back a little bit with Parker before Salesforce. Anyways, keeping in touch with him and all that. And he gives me a call and he says, now would be a great time to join. Why don't you come in? 2001. Things are a little rocky in Silicon Valley right now. This is when everything is flaming out, right, with the dot-com implosion. I'm at a company. I'm on the retrenchment team because $65 million of investment after we've gone through that, winding down the company. So I come in December of 2001, go through the interview process. It was a small company at the time, maybe about 75 people. And you interview with Mark. And at the end of the interview, it's great. Okay, so we want to hire you. And then I said, well, this is awesome, except I have one problem. I'm on the retrenchment team and actually working with Jimson at the time, wherever he is, hobbling around. Oh, there he is. The retrenchment team, so Jimson was still there. He was actually on that same team as well. And what happened is that we were about to wind everything down. We had large customers like Coca-Cola, which is a very large customer of Salesforce right now too. And at the time, we were about to dump CDs on the doorstep of everyone that had a software escrow agreement with us. So all you folks are in IT, you know the deal. It's like imagine taking an ASP service and just, here's your CDs, good luck. So I said to Mark, I said, this is really bad. I really want to help these customers out. He said, oh, in that case, why don't you go help your customers first, then come back? And I thought it was like, okay, now I just lost my job opportunity. And then he said, no. So you figure out how much time you need. And it was like, wow, that's amazing. So I left. Actually, Jimson helped with that project. He snuck the software, the code out, and I drove my car behind the office where we were. And we did a flyby in terms of handing the CDs for me so I can go stand up the systems. But that was my first experience with Mark being the compassionate capitalist, because they held my offer there, and I actually formally joined in March of 2002, 3 months after that. So that was just awesome.
Just a side note, it was in between periods of the Olympic hockey in the Salt Lake City Olympics 2002. We did it between the second and third period.
So Jimson and I are Canadian. That's why there's the hockey reference there. But very good, thanks. So I was hired originally as the product manager for the API, and at that time, XML RPC was kind of a de facto standard in terms of data interchange at that point. So we had an XML RPC implementation that we provided. If you think about it from the RESTful interfaces that we are now accustomed to, we've kind of come around full circle, kind of like a Back to the Future type thing right there as well. So much to kind of accolades and all that stuff. We got a lot of press going. At the time, in the company, we actually had just a few product managers. So the other individuals there, Teen Zoe. People know Teen from Zuora, maybe? People know Zuora? A few. So that's the subscription as a service, kind of the billing piece in terms of actually management and stuff like that. So Teen was the original product manager on Salesforce. And I can go into other stories, which I won't belabor you right now, but in terms of how strong, in terms of actually flipping engineering around and having product management drive engineering, Teen is responsible for what we know of as Salesforce right now. Judy Lohr, she's the one who did service and support and the early service and support and also marketing. And Sarah McKenna did all of what you know as Sales Cloud right now back in the beginning. But it was a very lean team. All of engineering at the time was 24 people, which included product management, the engineers that were actually coding, and QA. And that actually took us all the way through our third year, which we'll get to, and we'll see how much revenue there was. But already, by the end of 2002, we had already leapfrogged, 2 years of revenue into this, 51 million in revenue, and now we have 3,500 paying customers. So we're off to the races. And now we're going to switch gears to birth of the platform, and I want to have actually Dave come up for that.
Thank you, Mike. The remote is working. Are you going to pin me up? All right. Right, so 2003, birth of the platform. There's a little bit of backstory. I'm really glad, actually, that I joined Salesforce when I did, because before that, I was an early partner. So like Mike knew Parker prior to Salesforce, I knew Mike prior to Salesforce. And I was running an ASP also in Silicon Valley. It was an ASP. We didn't quite have software as a service at that point. And the company was targeting pre-IPO technology companies in Northern California. So you can imagine what happened when the bubble burst. Our target market was basically burst with it. And so we were winding that company down. I was working about 50%. And Mike says, hey, Dave, we need somebody to write an Outlook plugin so that we can do competes against Microsoft. I think you could do that. And I'm like, sure, I'm only working half-time, so why not? And so I built an Outlook plugin called Dovetail, and got a few customers, and that was great until they started having problems and we had to start supporting them. But it was about 2003 when Mike said, hey Dave, we're also starting a new platform developer group. Do you think you'd mind coming in and talking to George and find out some more about it? So I said, yeah, sure, why not? And so that's how I joined the team. And I say I'm glad I did it because when I built that plugin, it was XML RPC to Microsoft Mappy. Anybody familiar with Mappy? It's the mail API, fun, right? It's great, lousy API. Anyways, so I think that put me in a good position to understand developers on our platform and be able to empathize with them. Empathy is really huge in our business. So anyways, on June 3rd, 2003, we launched the platform. What's really interesting about that particular slide, I don't know if you noticed it, but we had some launch partners, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But before I get going on the rest of this, on the launch partners, one of the things that is very interesting to me now, seeing where we came from, is I'm like the world's worst Salesforce.com user, right? I really don't care that much about CRM, and somehow I got this platform vision ingrained in me at the time that I was speaking to Salesforce, at the time that I was developing that partner product. And so, in fact, the idea for the platform was there at the very beginning of Salesforce, of the CRM system. And I know this because there used to be, Mark held the license or the rights to the URL database.com. As a matter of fact, that was one of the companies that he was trying to start at the same time as Salesforce. And so that didn't work out so good, and so Salesforce, he switched it around. He's like, okay, we're going to build a SaaS application, but we're also going to make a platform underneath that so that you can build apps on it. All right, and so here we are. It's, what is it, June 3rd. We go into, I've been with the company for 3 months now, and in that 3 months was like, just wrapping my head around. Mike says, here's our SDK. We have a Java SDK, and you should take a look at it and think about what kind of documentation to begin writing. And I looked at it, and he gave me a jar file. I'm like, what the hell am I supposed to do with this? I was a .NET developer. And he said, well, just run it. And I'm like, okay, what's a class path? Didn't know anything about that. It was just an awful experience. But at any rate, we end up in New York at the launch for this thing, and it was in a place called the Grand Havana Club. Anybody familiar with the Grand Havana Club? I think there's one in LA and one in New York. It's a very exclusive cigar bar, which seems like a weird venue to launch a platform. But what's interesting is we brought these partners with us. 3 of them are no longer a going concern, right? They've either died out or been acquired by other companies. But what's important about this is Mark understood right away that this launch needed to be to have a real backing by the rest of the technology industry. And so Mark and Mike together flew up to Microsoft in Seattle, talked to a couple of people up there, and I'll mention a little bit more about those guys in a minute. Went down to Bourne, and so Mark and Mike are just like, you guys got to check this out. You got to get on board with this. And so we were actually able to peer position this nascent platform with the likes of Sun and Microsoft, Borland, and BEA, which was pretty cool. So this was when we were at the launch, we had to have something to show, right? And so this is a picture of an invoice. At the time, this was part of a Microsoft Smart document. I don't know if anybody remembers these things. So it was a document that had intelligence, knew about XML. And Downhill Bikes was actually one of the reference applications being used by Microsoft to educate their developers on SQL Server and some of their other technologies. And so we thought, well, what better way to demonstrate the power of the platform than to swap out SQL Server on the back end and put yet to become Force.com in place of it. And so that's what we did. And it was quite impressive and very successful. So anyways, here's these fellows. And as Mike and I were going over this presentation today, we started, just like checking our facts on some of their history and stuff. And this is an amazing group of people right here. So Dale Fuller, this is the guy who, at the time, Dale, I just got to make sure I've got him right. Yeah, so he's the CEO of Borland at the time, and he had just become CEO at Borland. And Mike and Mark drove down to Santa Cruz, was it, or Scotts Valley, and chatted with him and got him on board. Of course, Daniel Llewellyn, he was like number 3 at Microsoft, and his claim to fame is like he's the original, not Microsoft, sorry.
Number 3 at Microsoft.
Oh, Microsoft, right. Number 3 at Microsoft, and he was like the original evangelist at Microsoft. It's the guy that hired Guy Kawasaki, right? Oh, he came from Apple, right. So anyways, he's the original evangelist at Apple, the guy who knows who Guy Kawasaki is. Okay, so look Guy Kawasaki up. He's pretty amazing. The thing I like about him most is his affinity to bozosity, or not affinity, his avoidance of bozosity. Bozosity is bozos, and you don't listen to bozos because they keep you down. He's got a great story around that, and I highly recommend that you check it out if you get a chance. So then, of course, Jonathan Schwartz over at Sun. Scott McNeely had just stepped down, right? And Jonathan's, so these guys are like leaders of the industry. And then there's Adam Bosworth, and Adam Bosworth, oh my gosh. When we were peeking into his background, so first of all, he was at Borland as well, the Quattro database. Anybody remember Quattro? Then he went to Microsoft, basically became one of the inventors of XML. He also created Microsoft Access. From there, he went to BEA via an acquisition of a company called CrossGain, which was basically their, their WebLogic server. So BEA's WebLogic platform is up to him as well. Then he went on to Google Health, and of course he's been at Salesforce for a while, and he's just recently left Salesforce. So these guys are all like, not only are they just figureheads, but they're also very good at contributing advice and technical help. So this cigar bar, there's women walking around with these trays of cigars, right? And so after we did all the presentations, everybody grabbed a cigar, and the place just reeked like crazy. It was awful. But once everything was done, Mike and I were tearing down because we were setting up and tearing down all the partner stations. We had a surprise visit by none other than Morpheus. So evidently, Lawrence Fishburne was a member there, and before we got everything torn down and left, he came in with his girlfriend and had a drink at the bar and smoked a cigar. So that was pretty cool. All right, so here we are at 2003. As we keep pointing out different kind of numbers here, at this point, again, we don't have a ton more customers, 5,700, but you can see the revenue is growing on this almost 2 times every year pace, double. And it's our very first platform brand. And that's important because we've had many platform brands, as I'm sure you're all very aware of, but Sforce was the first.
This is Jeopardy!
Right? So, did you know? 3 months, we're into this building developer community in 3 months, and we realized right off the bat that we needed to be able to provide the developers with an environment in which they could exercise the software, be able to try it out for themselves, do some testing, understand what it's all about. And so Developer Edition was created. So basically Mike was the brainchild of this, and we had a trial. And so we decided, well, let's just take the trial, remove the expiration date, take down some of the storage requirements and user capability, and call it Developer Edition. And that's what we did. So we came up with Developer Edition.
And we all forever grateful.
Sorry?
We all forever grateful for Developer Edition.
Yes, I am too. I consider myself a developer on the platform, so I'm grateful as well. But part of it was also like there was a lot of data in it, and so we needed to pare down the data and do a bunch of stuff. So we took that opportunity between us to do a couple of things, put a couple of Easter eggs in. And so there's 2 contacts in every single Developer Edition, Siddhartha Nadarek, which is actually Siddhartha Kreaden, and Jake Lorak, which is actually Jake Carroll, and they're still in there today, so kind of a fun thing. Those are our kids, by the way, our children. An homage. Right, so at the time that we launched Sforce, the platform, and again, we're back in 2003, we had about 20 different apps, partners that were building apps already. Some of these are no longer around. AvantGo, anybody remember AvantGo? Come on, nobody?
That was a breakthrough mobile app. Amazing platform.
That was for that pager thing, right? What was that thing called? I don't remember. But there's also some companies in here that should look familiar to you. ExactTarget, Vertical Response, Eloqua, which now is owned by Oracle, right? So these guys got on early and actually made a pretty good go of it. Another one, another great story is Dream Factory in here?
Yeah.
So there's a company called Dream Factory, and Mike knows more about the CEO of that company than I do, but his name is Bill Appleton. And what was the Mac thing?
Supercard.
He wrote Supercard for the Apple.
Called Hypercard, and he created a commercial version of it that was bigger and better called Supercard.
Supercard. So Bill was writing this, at the time, very advanced kind of JavaScript-based UI development platform for Force.com. And we brought Bill in, and Mark saw it, and he's like, okay, we want it. We're going to buy you guys, right? And we didn't. Things didn't actually work out, but that could have been a completely different direction that the company went. So it's kind of like one of those inflection points where history would have been completely different. So that's what I got for this section. I'm going to go ahead and toss it back to Mike to talk about the marketplace emergence.
Right. Okay, so now we actually have kind of 2 pieces of the puzzle that we put together right now. We actually have enough bits put together, and how many folks remember S-controls? They didn't really S-controls, that was the big innovation. So what Sforce was, because we had an API before, and I was trying to figure out, it's like, okay, what does Mark mean? We're going to be a platform. We have an API. And I was like, well, okay, fine. But we actually did a couple of advancements. We had custom objects, we had S-controls, and we had one more thing. Where'd Dave go? We had one more thing. It was, the SOAP API, which we did. That was the last thing I did. I wrote the spec for the SOAP API, and then there was another individual, Benji Jasek, which we'll get to in a moment, who actually did that. But the next piece of the puzzle that we needed was a marketplace. So what happened was, the story behind this one is that those launch partners that we actually convinced to partner with us, it was a different exercise that we went through, because it wasn't about just writing to our API. We needed them on board. We needed them supporting our customers. So what we did is we said, like any good company would, it's like build through our platform and we'll help you out. Well, they said, well, how are you going to help us out? Are you going to sell our stuff? Well, no, we're not going to sell your stuff. What are you going to do? We'll help to market it. So I come back, I'm talking with my boss at the time, who's Teen, and then he said, look, we can't just list these partners on our website. That kind of listing thing is kind of outdated and all that stuff. He said, come on, let's take a chapter from the consumer web again. So why don't we have kind of an open forum where we can actually have like a listing and have customers review it, have a star rating, and that was actually the on-demand marketplace. But this is a startup now. We're still relatively early now. So what happened is that this is going back now, predating AppExchange, which we'll get to in a second, 2003, 2004 timeframe. So Teen says, okay, this is what we're going to do. We agreed on the spec on a Thursday. So he said, so let's have it done by Monday. And then I'm thinking, okay, yeah, we'll get the prototype up, we'll do it, whatever. I'm still, doing product management at this time, and all product managers at Salesforce, even to this day, still have to know how to code the stuff that they're asking the engineers to build. Isn't that novel in terms of like what a product manager should do? Anyway, so it's a Thursday, I start coding it. Friday's coming around, I'm starting to sweat. I run into a bug. Parker actually helps me solve the bug. Over the weekend, work day and night, and then I get this thing up and running under my desk, and I show it to Teen. He says, awesome, let's go live. So I was working with one of our web front-end guys at the time. We already had an infrastructure, built up an XML infrastructure for doing the translation for presentation for our core website. That's how we actually designed this thing. But what I did was I actually used Salesforce on the back end. I had all of the partner information already in Salesforce. I was tracking as my accounts, right? As we were going to market with the products, that was an opportunity for me. So I had all the information there. So all that I was doing was I was just generating an XML file and spitting it out. Very early architecture of what was now familiar in the Force.com world, right? So then, taking a step forward now, we then had a few pieces of the puzzle that we needed to put together. So if you remember our first brand that we actually launched and talked about, Sforce, we then came up with another one, Custom Force. And Mark was talking about this at various events that we were doing at the time. Multi-Force. So Custom Force was about custom objects. Multi-Force was about the application picker that we're all familiar with in terms of the AppExchange menu that you know of right now. And that's heritage goes back to the early Macintosh days when there was something called Multi-Finder, which was just a in-memory switcher for switching between applications. And then we did AppForce, which was the ability to package apps. So every time we actually iterated and we created a new capability, we actually rebranded what we were doing with the platform. So it was this incredible exercise of trying to keep up with the branding. And then ultimately, we got to the AppExchange. And at 2005, early 2005, we were trying to figure things out. Actually, it dates back to 2004 November, because that's when the spec for the AppExchange was written. And then we were moving very quickly at this time. We talked about in terms of the revenue jumps that we were seeing. Imagine for any company, it's really hard to manage. So Parker still has this philosophy of small teams rule. This is, remember, before Agile right now, and it was like hard to keep things going. So we came up with this idea. Teen was head of product management. He said, I got a great idea, outsourcing. It's all the rage. Think about it in the early 2000s. It's all the rage. Why don't we do it? So what happened is that Teen says, I know some guys, let's do this. My connection's in China, I can get this thing done. November we get the spec delivered. We start with our cadence meetings in terms of reviewing stuff. And then I can remember in March-ish of 2005, we have a meeting where we're reviewing one of the deliverables. And then we all look around at each other in the meeting and going, holy cow, we are not going to make it. So we actually had at that time an amazing team. So we had Benji Jasek was the one who actually wrote the original spec for the AppExchange. Benji Jasek is head of customer-centric engineering at Salesforce now. And he was a product manager after me at Salesforce. He's the one that brought us to SOAP and Sockle and all that wonderful stuff that you use right now. Teen, obviously I've talked about him enough. Judy was one of the original product managers, remember? And we hired this amazing guy from Sun, Lou Tucker, was well known in the Valley in terms of running communities, and he had worked on Java actually while at Sun Microsystems. But he was in charge of this, and he looked around and he said, we got to scrap this thing and we got to try to throw a Hail Mary here. Because Mark wanted this to be released in September he wanted to actually announce this thing. He actually wanted it released, but announced this at Dreamforce. So Lou pulled me aside and he said, on-demand marketplace, how did you do that? How did you architect that thing? And I said, obviously with Salesforce. And they said, that's it. So he pulled Judy in, one of the original product managers. He put Judy on that, and a couple of amazing engineers that we have, past CTOs of Salesforce as well. But what they did was they put together that project from March until September. We then had to do a mad dash to re-architect the solution. I was already working with some early partners at the time, seeding the original AppExchange, because it was a new novel way of packaging apps and distributing and stuff like that. And we actually, thankfully, made it at that time. So now for the second trivia test here. We're getting into the realm of where some folks actually might have some information here, or at least know this thing. So I think that there's a lot of stuff, or a little bit of stuff actually written now in terms of Mark's kind of hero, who was Steve Jobs. And there was an opportunity roughly around this time for Mark and Parker to meet with Steve Jobs. And they met with Steve, and it was one of those, seminal meetings where, the little sensei meets meets the guru and is going through, all the accolades and all that stuff, wonderful stuff. And after that meeting, Steve Jobs calls Mark, and Mark's all excited. Oh, this is awesome. Steve Jobs calling me back. This is great. He's still like a little kid, to Steve in this. And what Steve was calling him about was, he says, well, the iTunes thing? Yeah. It's like, well, we're going to be doing something, which was the iPhone, and we want to come to market with something that you own. It's the App Store. Because when we were coming to market with the AppExchange, it wasn't called the AppExchange. It was the Enterprise App Store. And that's why if you look at some of the early branding around how we were messaging, it was the Enterprise App Store. It was the eBay of enterprise software. We had all this stuff. So we had the domain for appstore.com. And Steve Jobs asked for it. And he was willing to pay for it. And Mark was like, no. If there's something that I can do for you, I will do this. And he actually gifted appstore.com to Apple. So we can actually thank, that conversation with Steve Jobs and that connection there. So at this time, we're kind of going like gangbusters at this point. We're, again, almost doubling in revenue every year. And by this point, in terms of 2005 now, a $300 million company, think about it, just a few years earlier, we were just generating our first year of revenue. So this was like, we really didn't know what was going on. It was like all the money was pouring in, but we were still operating like a lean machine. So now the next piece comes into play. So we have this marketplace, we actually launch this thing, and that's when reality hits. It's like, okay, customers are expecting apps. How are we going to get apps? Well, we found out that we needed developers. So what do we need to get real developers? We needed a real language. We needed a presentation framework. So we were Java and Oracle developers. So what we did is we took a chapter from there. It's got to be object-oriented. Okay, let's do Apex. We needed to have something familiar. Kind of like JSPs. Let's do Visual Force, a markup language. And the last piece, which is a lot of Dave and also another individual I'm going to mention in a second, is a developer network. So MSDN, which was big. People from the Microsoft side of things would know that. So we said, well, we'll be the AppExchange developer network. And that's where ADN came from. So at that point, around the same time that Dave started, we needed product management for Sforce. We hired an individual, Adam Gross, to come in to do that. Adam he had come into Salesforce, then had left, did a product which was called Salesforce Connect, which we then acquired, became Heroku Connect, and he's now the CEO of Heroku. And we had a few other players here that I wanted to mention as well, because they don't get all the recognition that they should. Mary Scotton. Any folks know Mary Scotton, Women in Tech and Diversity and all that stuff? Well, Mary was one of our amazing product managers, and she was one of the driving forces behind a lot of the declarative stuff that we see that ultimately became Force.com, including, the little Force.com, the little slider that you have to be able to quickly get to your objects and stuff like that to jump into setup. That was her invention too. Eric Bizar was her boss. Eric Bizar afterwards, so he was in charge of declarative on the customer side, okay, for all those amazing features that were coming into fruition ultimately into Force.com. He ended up leaving with another individual to go to start a company called Viva, which I'll get to in a minute. And then Andrew Waite. Andrew was the genius behind Apex and Visual Force, so we owe him obviously a lot. And David Brooks was the first time we actually brought on a product manager to actually think about ISVs and commercial developers. What do they need in the platform? Because we were building and designing to our customers, not to the third parties and to the ISVs. So at this point as well, we had just launched the AppExchange. January 2006 is when we turned the lights on. So Mark immediately came up with the idea, we need an incubator. I don't want to wait for applications to come. We launched with 70 applications in the AppExchange, but he wanted more. We need to show a reference point. So we actually started the incubator in January of 2006. We had a host of companies that came through. This is just kind of a sampling right now. But how many folks know Aperio as a company? Okay, great. So Aperio actually started. So we had Chris and Narinder. The story here is that I did the build out of the building. So I was the first person in, obviously, before our guests come in. And then on day one, when we're up in the incubator, I'm coming in bright and early, and I get a phone call in my car, and it's Chris from, Chris,
Bourbon.
thank you, Barbin. Chris Barbin from Peer, and he says, how do you like your coffee? Why? Because I'm already in the office. It's like, oh, you're a super keener. Little did I know that they would go on to do great things and all that stuff. But we had a lot of great companies in there, and there were some of the things to note in terms of kind of, one of the badges of honor when you're running an incubator or accelerator program. It's kind of where folks come on. So we had a lot of successful acquisitions that came out of that, including a UK company, because we actually had a few international companies as well. ClickTools eventually got acquired. And we also had a couple of companies that went public. So it was kind of interesting having worked with these companies. And you got to note that with these companies, one revenue stream for them was Salesforce. But I know, because I know the numbers behind the scenes here. For both of these companies that went public, over 70% of the revenue was coming from the Salesforce customer base. So it was very, very strategic for them to actually be there. And now we're fast forwarding, 2007 arrives, and we have a whole bunch of goodies in the package now that we're rolling out. And we had all the declarative work that was being done by Eric Bizar's team with Mary Scotton and others. We had amazing stuff in terms of programmatic, right? So now we had the real platform emerges in terms of Force.com. And that was where things start to get exciting. So I don't know how many people were at Dreamforce in 2007. Anybody? So this was the launch video, abridged. I don't want to bore you guys. But this was the launch video that we did for Force.com.
The first of our commission.
And it was actually, the first commissioned video that we actually did at Salesforce. Remember on-demand computing? So platform as a service, by the way, was a term that we actually coined. And we worked with Gartner and Forrester and a whole bunch of others so that we could actually get that to stick. And the tagline, innovation, not infrastructure, which is still around, that's where we coined it as well. So that truly was an amazing time for us. That's when everybody in the company, we really felt like we were a platform company at that time with the launch of Force.com. So the key thing is that now we could start talking about the kind of proliferation of apps. So we went from 70 at launch at that point to 400 apps in the first year, and we doubled in the next year to 800 apps. So things basically hit that hockey stick. We did a lot of things to do that. It wasn't just the incubator. It wasn't just a lot of the marketing that we're doing. It was a lot of the groundwork that we were doing in the community as well, in terms of supporting all the developers. And at that point in time, we had a sum total of about 8,000 developers. Now we're going to go to the next, the next phase, and that's where it's all about apps. And this was, in terms of being a platform company, one of the things that we needed to do is we needed to actually attract developers. So if anybody was back in 2008, that was what we called at that time the year of the developer. And it was the year of the developer because we actually did a city tour of 21 cities, starting off in San Francisco, and we called it Tour de Force. This was the brainchild of Adam Gross, in terms of let's take everything we have, and it was the first time, and you guys experience this right now, but in terms of being a first-class citizen, this was the first time. First time we spent big money on developers. We're going to treat them right. We're going to give them the content that they need. And that was the kickoff. And I think that that was actually a big piece of kind of how we got to the next level. And the next piece of the puzzle in terms of us putting things together, it wasn't good enough just to write an add-on for Salesforce. What would it be like if we could actually get people to build on this platform and not just build an app, but build a company? So we were doing that with a lot of the companies like ServiceMax and Financial Force, which was another one, which is one of the guys up here. But in terms of all of these early OEM pioneers, just to give a call out, Peter Gassner was my boss and Dave's boss in the early days of the platform. He went on to build a company called Viva, which is the most successful company by investment standards in Silicon Valley. More successful than Twitter, more successful than Facebook. Why? There was $4 million that went in late in the game. He was cash flow positive after 8 months. He agreed to take on investment capital, venture capital money, because he needed help going public. So he took on a $4 million investment. He gave away a piece of the company, and that company went public for $4.3 billion when it floated. The return to the investors was $1.5 billion. And that company is called Emergence Capital, which is the darling of SaaS, of business SaaS in the Valley. And that basically put them on the map. Bob Morell is Risk Connect, if anybody knows Risk Connect. That's one of the first ones. Atani Krishna Prasad was one of the founders of ServiceMax. Kirk Krape, Aptus, folks know Aptus? One of the paper unicorns that we have out there right now. Jeremy Roche, Financial Force. These were folks that started with Chris Cabrera, Exactly, Ted Elliott, Job Science, and Ed Schlesinger, Student Force, which was actually the first reference OEM app on the platform. Unfortunately, it was never really commercialized, but it was one of those things that the idea is what inspires others. And then next, in 2007, we did the Force.com Challenge. And the Force.com Challenge was our first opportunity for you to come and effectively pitch an idea, VCs in the audience, and potentially get some money. And it was billed as a $1 million challenge. What happened was that Mark was in the audience. He liked things so much. When Mark gets excited, another $1 million gets thrown on the table. So we ended up having, the winner at that time was ServiceMax. It was a consulting company. If anybody here is in a consulting company and has great ideas, I don't mean to pull anybody out of consulting companies, but I'm just saying. We had 2 consultants who had domain expertise in field service. And they had a company called Maxplore at the time. And they were just doing consulting. They got together a reference application, called it ServiceMax. It got funded, and that company's worth over $800 million right now, at current valuation. So we're ending now 2009, over 100,000 custom apps. So in other words, it's not just about ISVs building apps. We actually are successful in getting our customers to build apps. And we're now in excess of $1 billion in revenue. So now we're going to advance and call Dave back up here, because we're getting close to the modern era. There you go.
So pretty interesting so far? Yeah? Never know how something like this is going to go over. Right, so platform and brand proliferation really started with the platform proliferation with Heroku. And in my mind, Heroku is, up until this point, we had made some acquisitions and acquired other companies, but Heroku was the first platform technology acquisition. So the first one for developers, right? And so I was pretty stoked about that. It also at the time was our most costly acquisition at like $230 million or whatever. And so, of course, one of the reasons why I think it's really great, Heroku's fun and it's kind of cool, but Mike was talking about the AppExchange, and we did have a lot of people building apps for the AppExchange, and at one point, people were building apps that had like middleware, right? So, anybody familiar with a governor limit? You've heard that term? Right? So, there's lots of applications that people want to build, maybe that email a million leads for you on a regular basis or something like that you just couldn't do on Salesforce, and so they were spinning up middleware and various other infrastructures, and we would call that a composite app. Right, and at one point in the AppExchange lifetime, we kind of turned our backs on people that were building composite apps, thinking, no, you got to build it entirely on our platform. So with Heroku, now there's a kind of, we don't feel that way anymore. You can build your middleware anywhere. We don't care about that. But Heroku gives you a place where we also can add the secret sauce, things like Heroku Connect and so forth. So very important acquisition. It also kind of like took in, hopefully all the developers said, oh, okay, here's something for us, right? They're actually serious about supporting us. And this one is great. I love this. Force.com 2.0. So anybody remember Web 2.0? I hear a couple of chorts and chortles. Are we in Web 3.0 yet? I don't know. I guess we dropped that versioning system. Anyway, so, a lot of Salesforce originated from looking at what's happening in the consumer web and bringing it to the business web. And that was kind of the original idea that Mark had. It's like, why can't everything in the enterprise be as easy to use as Amazon.com, right? There's no deep manual of how to use Amazon.com. So why should that be the case with business software? And so this is another kind of take on that. At the time, the consumer web was 2.0. That was a buzzword, and so we jumped on that. But more importantly, this is a point in time where we got really crazy with our slides. This is called the chiclet slide. You guys are familiar with chiclets, the square gum, and so. That notwithstanding, what this really does illustrate, though, is that all of the different distinct services that were starting to surface as part of the platform. Some of them may have been there in support of the rest of the SaaS applications, but over time we started surfacing them so that developers could use them as a platform technology. You can see we've got Sales Cloud 2, Service Cloud 2, all part of Cloud 2. Again, that's the brand proliferation. But what's important, again, is that these things are like microservices before microservices was a term that we make available to you. Now, up until that point, I think we were pretty traditional in the way that we talked about both Salesforce and the platform. In other words, it's just another piece of software. We talked about it like other software companies would. And when we brought Chatter in, we started to realize that it's more than just software, right? It's a way to think differently about the enterprise. We became feed-based. And instead of talking about the technology, we were talking about, well, you need to have social interaction within yourselves to be able to collaborate, and also to think about the social interaction with your customers, and so kind of like abstracted the message from the actual technology and deliverables to something a little bit higher. Also at this time, we went all in for mobile. Right? Actually, our first acquisition was a mobile company, Sendia. I think, how much did we pay for Sendia? Is that public? Very small, 30 or 40 million, Mike says. And that was in 2004, maybe, something like that. Anybody remember Salesforce Mobile, the briefcase that you would configure? Figure out what stuff you knew you had to have offline. But the move to mobile was a big shift for us. And I think this next slide, for those of you who have been here long enough, should bring some smiles to your face. What's this called? Touch. Salesforce Touch.
What if not called Salesforce Touch?
I don't know.
In one interview, you said it was a total catastrophe.
I wouldn't say it's a total catastrophe, and it wasn't a huge success. It was amazing technology, but it was just like there wasn't, the functionality wasn't there. It was incomplete, right? But it also taught us that, you know, we need to think differently about how we support mobile and how we support just web technologies in particular, which kind of drove our move to REST APIs to begin with. Up at that point, our SOAP APIs, we were doing, you know, millions of transactions a day. It wasn't a problem, but it just wasn't the right kind of API for really simple user interactions to the back end. It was more of an integration technology. Right, so that brings us to another milestone, and I love thinking about this slide because, not because of the revenue. I mean, numbers with B's are great. The number of customers is awesome, but it's the developer number. So in 2008, we had 8,000 developers, and in 4 years, 2 orders of magnitude increase in the number of developers. Some of those were Heroku developers, but for the most part, it's just like, it really does kind of illustrate the emphasis that we put on the platform and the way that hopefully we hit some right notes because the number of developers were increasing and becoming successful on it. And so, that brings us to phase 3, developer democratization, and this is bringing us kind of current. There's been a few kind of buzzwords or brands or messages that Salesforce has come out with that I really love, and one of them was the democratization of software, enterprise software, which is the whole point behind the subscription model. You have the same software as the largest companies, just fewer licenses, so you can afford it. And now we're talking about developer democratization. I think maybe I might want to change that a little bit at some point to be app development democratization because we're not turning everybody into developers, but we are enabling people to build apps using the technologies. And that is based on Lightning, right? So we've got you guys know Lightning? Ever heard Lightning? Okay, so Bob, what is Lightning?
What isn't Lightning?
That's unfortunately the perception, right? Yeah, but Lightning is the realization of this app development democratization, where we give you the ability to build mobile experiences on the desktop using the platform, but also to participate in the ecosystem as a developer. And Lightning Components is really the key for that. So this is where we get into the technical part of the talk. So, thank you, Mike, for the great meme and the history and everything. Who's written a Lightning component? Just need to get a take here. Okay, a few. Does everyone know what a Lightning component is? Because I'm not going to tell you what it is here. So Lightning component, I'll briefly, Lightning components are pieces that you assemble together to create bigger components or apps or whatever, right? So it's a modular way of building your apps. And one of the great promises of Lightning components is the ability to reuse components. An admin can reuse a component that you've built to play well inside of App Builder in different scenarios. You can reuse, as a developer, a component that you've built before, maybe one that somebody else has built. But I want to think about reuse at a slightly different level to try to get you guys thinking a little bit differently about this. So, the traditional thinking around components today, if I could assume that there's a tradition built up at this point, is that components are mini apps, right? So there's a lot of functionality inside the component, and then you place it on a page, and you've magically got like almost a whole new feature alongside your other stuff. And these are traditional thinking, not incorrect thinking. Just want to point that out. So also single page apps, right? So I can use Lightning components to create a single page app. That's the .app component, right? Which is fine. It's great. But it doesn't have to be that way. Or maybe they're just little widgets, so a button or a new way to visualize your opportunity amount or something that you can stick on a page. And so a lot of people consider that to be a component. And finally, before finally, they need to have a UI. So does everybody agree that a component needs to have a UI? Because it's made up of HTML and JavaScript and CSS and some other assets, right? Well, traditionally, that's kind of the assumption. And that components are generally use case specific. So if I'm going to code up a component to do something, that's all it's going to be able to do. If I want it to do something else, I either go redo it or create a new component. So that's traditional thinking. And what I hope to be able to do today is to expand your mind a little bit in thinking about components and reuse. First of all, what do we mean when we talk about compositing an app? Right? It's a root word of component composite. You know, they're very similar, I think. And so we take things and we composite them together to build an app. And why do we even bother compositing an app? Well, hopefully we can assemble these much quicker than starting from a blank page every time. The fact that we're creating components allows admins to enjoy some of the goodness of the great components that we've built. But my question is, what else can be reused? If we think about reusing components themselves, is there another way that we can think about the components and how they're made where we can apply reuse to them? And so I would submit that there is this thing called a service component that you should think about. Service component, let's get into it. Not really? Well, so a service component is actually a component that provides zero user interface. Okay? It is basically meant to simplify access to web services. Right? The service component listens to be told what to do. So a service component would sit there in your component and just wait for you to tell it to do something. And then finally, the service component would broadcast the fact that it's completed whatever task it is that you've asked it to do. So at this point, I'm going to do a brief demonstration, but I'm going to have to do a little prep work first. This is a Yelp component, and it's going out and just taking address and location information in a search term and talking to Yelp. And this was done in Wales. So it's taking Mr. Sean Holmes' address in Wales, and it has a little mapping feature. I can go ahead and ask it to search for sushi in Wales. And there is some. Surprise, surprise. What's interesting about this is if I go ahead and do steakhouse, so you see that little waity wait thing? I'm going to do sushi again. And it's like, bam, really fast, right? And I'll talk about that in a minute. So that's a service component. Now, if I built this component like this and put it in the component exchange or whatever, you're kind of stuck. with what I've determined is a useful UI. But if I composite that out, decompose it into a service component and a UI component, now you have the flexibility of maybe using my presentation layer component or building your own. And so let me just go ahead and bring up Sublime, and I'll show you what that looks like. Oops. Okay, so the component itself looks like this. Now, it looks like a lot, but that's actually the whole thing. I've got a couple of attributes down here, right, so that I can communicate data in and out of the component. And I also have this register event. So that's the component saying, hey, my data's ready. And then I've got a couple of handlers so that I can know when my host has changed something, in essence asking me to go get more data. Now the thing that I wanted to show in the middle here is this Aura set tag. Does anybody know what this is doing? Just by reading it maybe? Yeah, this is handling the cache, the Lightning component cache, and every component has its own cache. And I haven't finished this component, but in thinking about if you have a service in the back of your head that you might think about writing a component for, one of the things that I would recommend is to surface the attributes of the cache values as public attributes that can be set by your host component. So if I don't do that, then my host has no control over the cache. In other words, if he wants me to go out and to the internet every time rather than to the cache, he can't force that to happen. So, and also you saw the difference in the speed on that. The cache will increase the performance of your components, but it will also save you API calls, right? So as we know, this component is actually talking to an Apex class that's making a call out, in this case, to a Heroku server that's eventually calling Yelp, but that initial call is an API call. And if you use the cache, if you don't really need to get fresh data, I mean, how often do the sushi restaurants change in Aberavon, Wales? Then why consume that call? So that's what the component looks like. The controller for this thing is super simple, and I'm not even using the init function. I think I was doing some debugging. But it's just making a helper call. And the helper call then has two methods in it. The get Yelp data, this is just checking to see whether it's an address or a lat lon that you passed in, and then setting up and calling an action. And then finally, when the data is returned, we check for an error. So that's a big old chunk of error handling right there. And then this is how it's super easy because all you have to do is send that JSON data out, and as a service component developer, you're done. Now, what it looks like on the actual host is, this is just a horrible size to render. I'm hesitant to make it any smaller. So this is the Yelp service component dropped into my presentation layer. I give it an ID so that I can do some things with it. I don't even know if I need that ID anymore. But then I give it a default address and a default search term. And so when those values are changed in the UI, right, that gets, I handle that change event back on the service component, and that's the trigger for it. Yeah, right. So that is the service component. What do you guys think? Is that a way of thinking? It's like we think about compositing and reuse, and I think if we keep slicing that, we might find even more reuse, which is going to make us more efficient and so on. So let's just jump back over to this guy. Right, so that component is actually part of a trailhead. So I took that component and I started dissecting it. But if you want to play with that Yelp component, we have a trailhead project that'll walk you through it. It's very nice. Also, the deconstructed service and host are in my GitHub account at that URL. You can just go there and search for Yelp. Go to D. Carroll on GitHub and search for Yelp, and it'll come up. Mike? You want to wrap?
So that brings us to kind of the modern era, and what I wanted to leave everybody with, and this is something that I can most probably go to at least a few people, at least a few people that can back me up with this, but I did a lot of favors for developers because when we were launching the AppExchange, I had to go around and convince people that this would be worthwhile for them. So like in the early days, even before the AppExchange, one of my best case studies is actually Glenn Wilson from CRM Fusion, where I had to convince to write to our API. Created a demand tool, CRM Fusion. He's very open with his revenue numbers, but he's doing millions of dollars in ARR right now with a company of 13 people. He's a developer, but he's also the CEO. And it's just a great story. I just love it. So where we are right now, with Lightning and with components, this is 2005 for the AppExchange with Lightning and the components. It's rough around the edges, it's hard, it's going to be difficult to get stuff done, but if you bear with it, there's a whole new economy that's coming out there, and that's actually a component-based economy. Because every one of you, if you're building apps, you're going to start thinking about architecting your new apps and potentially re-architecting apps with a component-based architecture because of some of the efficiencies that Dave was talking about. It's just a lot better for you to be able to do this and think about the additional value that you can deliver to your customers in terms of having something that can be deconstructed, but adding value where they can actually use App Builder to use components that you provide to them to do things that you don't even imagine. So that's kind of the last thing to leave you guys with. But with that, thank you very much for coming today.